What if everything you know about Vikings is a carefully constructed fantasy? What if the bearded warriors and horned helmets, the fearsome raiders who terrorized medieval Europe, never existed at all? Today we're going to dismantle one of history's most successful deceptions, and the evidence is hiding in plain sight on maps drawn centuries ago. Our investigation begins not with ancient sagas or archaeological digs, but with a simple question that no historian wants to answer. Open any navigation chart from the 16th or 17th century, and you'll notice something strange. The prime meridian, the line that marks the center of the world, doesn't pass through Greenwich or any major European capital. Instead, it cuts through Iceland, a remote volcanic island at the edge of the known world. Why would the most sophisticated cartographers of their era choose such an insignificant location as the axis point for all global navigation? The answer to this riddle will lead us to a civilization that has been systematically erased from history, replaced with a romantic myth that serves to hide an uncomfortable truth about who really controlled the northern seas. But before we can expose this deception, we need to examine the maps themselves, because they contain evidence that contradicts everything we've been taught. The most revealing of these is the work of Gerardus Mercator, the father of modern cartography. His maps are still used today as the foundation for navigation, yet there's one detail on his charts that makes academics deeply uncomfortable. In the far north, above Scandinavia, Mercator drew a massive continent. This isn't a vague sketch or an artistic flourish. It's a detailed landmass divided by 4 rivers, with a towering mountain at its center positioned directly at the North Pole. Modern scholars dismiss this as fantasy, claiming Mercator simply filled empty space with mythology when he lacked real data. But this explanation falls apart the moment you examine his methodology. Mercator was obsessively precise. He calculated the positions of cities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas with mathematical accuracy that still impresses us today. Why would a man who staked his reputation on scientific rigor suddenly abandon all discipline and invent an entire continent? The answer is simple. He didn't invent it. He copied it from older sources, maps that documented the world as it existed before a catastrophic change in sea levels. Here's where it gets interesting. If you take Mercator's Arctic continent and overlay it on a modern map of the ocean floor, something remarkable happens. Lower the sea level by 150 to 200 meters, and suddenly his fantasy becomes reality. The continental shelves around Spitsbergen, Franz Josef Land, and Novaya Zemlya rise from the depths and connect into vast landmasses. What we see today as scattered islands are merely the mountain peaks of a sunken northern territory. Mercator wasn't drawing myths, he was documenting lands that had recently disappeared beneath the waves. This revelation forces us to ask a disturbing question. If these lands existed within recorded history, who lived there? The official answer is nobody, because acknowledging inhabitants would require rewriting entire chapters of European history. But the evidence of their existence is everywhere, once you know where to look, starting with a name that appears on every one of these ancient maps. The body of water in Europe's far north is labeled the Murmansk Sea on charts dating back to the 1500s. This presents an immediate problem for the official timeline. According to historians, the city of Murmansk wasn't founded until 1916. The port and the name associated with it supposedly didn't exist before the 20th century. Yet, here it is on maps created 400 years earlier. How could a 16th century cartographer know a name that wouldn't be coined for another 4 centuries? The standard explanation is linguistic gymnastics. We're told that Murmansk is simply a corrupted form of Norman, meaning men of the north. Supposedly the sound shifted over time, N became M, and through various translations and mispronunciations, Norman transformed into Murman. This sounds plausible until you examine who would have been doing this corrupting. Mercator was working in Western Europe, compiling information from Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish navigators. These were the maritime powers of the age, the ones making the discoveries and charting new waters. If they sailed north and encountered the region, they would have called it the Norman Sea in their own languages. There's no mechanism by which their clear European terminology would be distorted into something else. Mercator, being a meticulous scientist, would have simply transliterated what the captains wrote in their logbooks. But perhaps he was using Russian sources instead. After all, these were waters near Russian territory. However, this creates an even bigger problem. In Russian, Chronicles and historical texts of that period, northern seafarers weren't called Normans at all. They were Varangians. This term is foundational to Russian history. The Varangian route, the calling of the Varangian princes, these concepts saturated the historical record. If Mercator had accessed Russian information, he would have written Varangian Sea, yet he chose neither the Western European Norman nor the Russian Varangian. He wrote Murman, a term that fits neither linguistic tradition. It's as if he knew about a third group, a people who were neither the Scandinavians of European understanding nor the Varangians of Russian chronicles. This wasn't a mistranslation. It was the actual name of a nation that history has worked very hard to erase. To understand who they were, we need to examine who historians have placed in their stead. And this brings us to the central fraud, the Vikings. The image is so powerful it's embedded in our collective consciousness. Horned helmets, long ships, with dragon prows, fearless warriors sailing from fjords to pillage and conquer. We've seen them in countless films, read about them in novels, even learned about their supposed exploits in school textbooks. The Viking Age is presented as historical fact, a well-documented period of Scandinavian expansion from roughly the 8th to the 11th centuries. But here's something that will shock you. If you go back to the actual medieval sources, the chronicles written by monks and scribes who witnessed these northern raids firsthand, the word Viking barely appears at all. Open the Frankish annals that describe attacks on monasteries. Read the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that document the invasions of England. Search through German ecclesiastical records. You won't find Vikings. Instead, you'll see these attackers described as pirates, heathens, Northmen, or simply Danes. The contemporary writers didn't give these raiders a romantic ethnic identity. They called them what they were, thieves from the sea. The term Viking did exist in Old Norse, but it wasn't an ethnicity or a nationality. It was an activity. To go Viking meant to go raiding, to engage in piracy. Using Viking as a blanket term for all Scandinavians of that era is like calling all modern Somalis pirates because piracy exists off their coast. It's not just inaccurate, it's a fundamental category error. So, where did our modern concept of Vikings come from? The answer is the 19th century. During the Romantic era, European nationalists were desperate to construct glorious pasts for their nations. Germany had its Teutonic Knights, France had Charlemagne, and England had Arthur. Scandinavia needed its own heroic mythology, and so writers, poets, and artists created one. They took the scattered references to northern raiders in medieval texts and constructed an entire civilization from whole cloth. This wasn't history. It was nation-building. The famous horned helmets never existed in actual Norse culture. They were invented by costume designers for Wagner's operas. The complex codes of honor, the sophisticated social structures, the romantic notion of noble warrior poets, all of this was projected backward onto groups of sea raiders who were, by contemporary accounts, considered brutal barbarians operating outside civilized society. The parallels to another historical fabrication are striking. Consider Mongolia. We're taught about a vast Mongol empire that conquered half the known world under Genghis Khan. Yet when European scholars arrived in Mongolia in the early 20th century, the locals had almost no awareness of this supposed glorious past. They were herders and farmers who had to be educated about their own history through textbooks written in Moscow and Beijing. Similarly, the fishermen and farmers of Scandinavia in the 1800s learned they were descendants of mighty Vikings only when nationalist scholars told them so. History was being written retroactively, filling a vacuum with convenient fiction. But every vacuum in the historical record exists for a reason. It usually conceals something that powerful interests don't want examined. In this case, removing the fictional Vikings from the narrative creates a massive problem. Who built the ships? The longships found in Scandinavian burial sites are technological marvels. These aren't crude rafts lashed together by primitive tribes. They're sophisticated ocean-going vessels with revolutionary design features. The hull construction uses a technique called clinker building that creates flexibility and strength simultaneously. The keels are designed to handle both deep ocean swells and shallow river navigation. The sail rigging demonstrates advanced understanding of aerodynamics and wind mechanics. These ships represent the pinnacle of maritime engineering for their era. In fact, they're so well designed that modern reconstructions, built with power tools and computer modeling, struggle to match their performance characteristics. We're asked to believe that scattered tribes living in wooden huts, people described in contemporary sources as crude raiders with no permanent settlements, suddenly developed the most advanced naval architecture in the world without any preceding technological evolution. It's absurd. You don't jump from fishing boats to ocean-crossing vessels without centuries of incremental innovation, extensive resources, and sophisticated mathematical knowledge. Someone built these ships, but it wasn't the semi-mythical Vikings of popular imagination. It was a civilization with capabilities that dwarf what we attribute to medieval Scandinavia. To find the real builders, we need to look at what else these alleged Vikings left behind, and here we encounter evidence that doesn't fit the primitive raider narrative at all. The physical remains tell a different story, one that academic archaeology prefers to ignore. The artifacts recovered from northern burial sites display a level of craftsmanship that seems impossible for the culture we're told created them. The jewelry is executed in a complex animal style, with interlocking patterns where creatures flow into each other in hypnotic, endless designs. This isn't the work of crude barbarians. It requires not just technical skill, but a sophisticated aesthetic philosophy, a completely different way of perceiving and representing reality. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the bodies themselves. In 2008, workers on the Estonian island of Saaremaa accidentally uncovered a mass grave while laying utility lines. The burial site, dated to what historians call the Viking Age, contained warriors interred in ships according to traditional northern custom. When anthropologists examined the remains, they found something that contradicted everything in the textbooks. These weren't just tall, strong men. They were different. The skulls showed distinct abnormalities, or rather consistent variations, that appeared across multiple individuals. The most striking feature was pronounced dolichocephaly, an extreme elongation of the cranium toward the back, creating an egg-like or melon-shaped profile. This wasn't an isolated case of individual deformity. It was a pattern across the entire group, suggesting a racial characteristic. Additionally, these warriors possessed massive, heavy jawbones, significantly larger than those of average humans. The skull structure indicated faces that would have looked distinctly non-human, perhaps even frightening to observers accustomed to typical European features. Modern anthropology has no comfortable category for these remains. They are dismissed as anomalies, variations within normal human ranges, anything to avoid the obvious conclusion. We're looking at evidence of a different race, a group of people whose physical structure set them apart from the populations around them. This explains why encounters with these northern raiders generated such terror in medieval chronicles. It wasn't just the violence. It was the uncanny nature of the attackers themselves, beings who looked almost human but not quite, whose appearance alone inspired legends and nightmares. Russian folklore preserves a memory of exactly such a people. The legends speak of the Chud, sometimes called the Chud with white eyes, a mysterious race that inhabited the northern lands before the coming of the Slavs. According to these stories, when faced with conquest or conversion, the Chud chose to go underground rather than submit, sealing themselves in caves and tunnels beneath the earth. Historians treat this as primitive mythology, but what if it's a garbled memory of actual events? The term white-eyed probably doesn't refer to eye color. It's more likely describing the alienness of their gaze, the unsettling appearance created by their unusual skull structure and facial features. These were the Murmans, the people who gave their name to the Northern Sea. They were tall, powerful, physically distinct, and they possessed knowledge and technologies that seem magical to their contemporaries. Their civilization controlled vast territories in the far north, the very lands that Mercator documented before they sank beneath the rising ocean. They built the sophisticated ships we attribute to Vikings, developed the complex metalworking techniques we see in northern artifacts, and established navigation systems advanced enough to map the entire northern hemisphere. And here's where another piece of the puzzle clicks into place. If this civilization dominated the Arctic and possessed superior geographic knowledge, then the navigation systems used by later European explorers weren't European inventions at all. They were inherited from the Murmans, and the proof is in the maps themselves, specifically in where they place the center of the world. Return to those 17th century charts we mentioned at the beginning. The prime meridian, the line that serves as the reference point for all longitude measurements, consistently passes through Iceland on maps created before the Greenwich Standard was established in 1884. Modern historians explain this by claiming Iceland or the Canary Islands were considered the western edge of the known world. But this makes no sense from a European perspective. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the centers of political and economic power were London, Paris, Rome, and Madrid. If European cartographers were establishing their own coordinate systems, they would have run the prime meridian through one of these capitals. Instead, they placed it through a remote volcanic island that had virtually no political significance. Iceland was a backwater, a place of ice and volcanic rock, with a tiny population and no resources worth mentioning. Why make it the axis point of the entire world? The answer becomes obvious once you accept that the coordinate system wasn't European in origin. For the Murmans, Iceland wasn't a remote outpost. It was likely the heart of their civilization. The island sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge, a massive geological feature that runs through the center of the Atlantic Ocean. It's one of the few places where this underwater mountain range breaks the surface. If Mercator's Arctic continent was real, if it represented the landmass that existed before sea levels rose dramatically, then Iceland would have been the highest point, the sacred mountain at the center of the Murman world. It would have been their capital, their technological hub, or their religious center. The prime meridian marked this location because the original maps, the ones European cartographers copied from, were created by the Murmans to document their own empire. The volcanic activity of Iceland takes on new significance in this context. The island is riddled with lava tubes, massive underground caverns created by flowing magma. Russian legends say the Chud went underground when their world ended. What if this isn't purely metaphorical? What if the Murmans, facing rising sea levels that were swallowing their territories, retreated into these natural underground spaces, using Iceland's geology as a final refuge? The prime meridian on ancient maps wasn't just marking a geographic position. It was pointing to the entrance, the gateway to what remained of their civilization after the surface world was lost. European navigators inherited these maps, but didn't understand their true meaning. They saw accurate coastlines and reliable navigation markers, so they copied the documents and used them without comprehending that they were looking at the remnants of another people's geographic knowledge system. Now the pattern becomes clear. The sophisticated ships, the advanced navigation, the metalworking skills, all of these were Murman technologies. The raids that medieval chroniclers documented weren't the work of primitive Scandinavian tribes suddenly developing military prowess. They were the death throes of a dying civilization. As the waters rose and consumed their lands, the Murmans were forced south onto the coasts of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Some integrated with local populations. Others, desperate and displaced, turned to raiding to survive. The people who attacked monasteries and coastal towns were refugees from a catastrophe, using the remaining ships and weapons of a culture that was collapsing around them. Within a few generations, their distinct racial characteristics would have been diluted through intermarriage. Their language would have been lost. Their history would have been forgotten. All that remained were strange artifacts that didn't fit the narrative, maps with impossible continents, and stories of white-eyed giants who vanished into the earth. This explains why the archaeological record of medieval Scandinavia is so peculiar. We find evidence of advanced technology and sophisticated culture appearing suddenly with no clear developmental path. The longships, the navigation instruments, the metalworking techniques, they don't emerge from a progression of simpler forms. They appear fully developed, as if dropped into the region from outside, because that's exactly what happened. The Scandinavians didn't develop these technologies. They inherited them from the Murmans, either through direct contact with refugees or by salvaging and copying what they found in abandoned settlements. The so-called Viking Age wasn't a Scandinavian cultural flowering. It was the aftermath of a civilizational collapse, the scavenger period when survivors picked through the ruins. But acknowledging this creates enormous problems for the official historical narrative. If the Murmans were real, if they controlled the northern seas until relatively recently, then the entire chronology of European expansion needs to be rewritten. The comfortable story of gradual development from Roman decline through medieval recovery to Renaissance flowering falls apart. Instead, we're forced to confront the possibility that history isn't linear, that advanced civilizations can be utterly destroyed, their very existence erased from memory within just a few generations. This is why the Viking myth was so important to create. It filled the vacuum left by the Murmans with a comfortable fiction that explained the artifacts without forcing uncomfortable questions. We can admire the courage of Viking warriors without asking where they got their technology. We can study Old Norse sagas without wondering why they describe geographic features that shouldn't exist. We can display longships in museums without acknowledging that the people who designed them possessed engineering knowledge that medieval Scandinavia couldn't have developed independently. The construction of the Viking myth serves the same purpose as the establishment of Murmansk in 1916. Both are cover stories designed to legitimize names and histories that don't fit the official line. When the Russian Empire founded a port above the Arctic Circle, they needed to explain why they chose the name Murmansk. So, they created a linguistic origin story about Normans and sound changes. But the name was already there on 400-year-old maps, waiting to be explained away. Similarly, when European historians in the 19th century had to account for the advanced artifacts and ship remains being discovered throughout Scandinavia, they couldn't admit ignorance. They couldn't say these technologies appeared from nowhere. So, they invented a civilization of Vikings that conveniently fit the evidence while avoiding deeper questions about who actually created these wonders. The genius of the deception is that it gives us just enough truth to be believable while hiding the bigger picture. Yes, there were raids from Scandinavia. Yes, some Scandinavians built ships and engaged in piracy, but these were the echoes of something much larger, the final gasps of the Murman civilization as it drowned in rising seas. Think about what this means for everything else we've been taught. If an entire advanced civilization can be erased and replaced with fictional Vikings in the span of a few centuries, what else has been hidden? How many other convenient myths are we accepting as established fact? The evidence is there in the elongated skulls that anthropologists don't want to discuss. It's there in the impossible preservation of wooden ships that supposedly sat in the ground for over 1,000 years. It's there in the maps that show continents where we're told there were only empty oceans. It's there in the prime meridian that points to a volcanic island instead of a European capital. Most of all, it's there in the name itself, Murman, which appears on medieval maps decades before it supposedly existed, marking a sea that was named not for distorted Normans, but for the actual people who controlled it. The people whose racial characteristics set them apart from their neighbors, whose underground refuges became legends of entire nations disappearing into the earth, whose sophisticated geographic knowledge system became the foundation for European navigation, even as their own existence was being systematically forgotten. This is why Iceland matters so much in this investigation. It's not just another data point, it's the key that unlocks everything else. The prime meridian, passing through Iceland, reveals that the coordinate systems Europeans claimed as their own were stolen. The volcanic caves of Iceland explain where the Chud went when they supposedly vanished underground. The elevation of Iceland as the center of the world makes sense only if you accept that it was the center of a now sunken polar civilization. Stand on the black sand beaches of Iceland today, looking out at the Atlantic, and you're standing at the edge of a lost world. Beneath those waves lies the answer to who really controlled the northern seas, who really built the ships we attribute to Vikings, who really created the navigation charts that allowed European exploration of the globe. The Murmans aren't a historical footnote or a linguistic curiosity. They were a race of people with elongated skulls and advanced technology who dominated the Arctic until catastrophic sea level changes destroyed their homeland within the last 1,000 years. Some fled south and were absorbed into Scandinavian populations, their genetic markers showing up today in populations with unusually tall stature and distinct cranial features. Others retreated to underground refuges in Iceland and elsewhere, perhaps surviving for generations before their lines died out or emerged to blend with surface populations. A few may have held out on isolated mountaintops that became the scattered islands we see today, maintaining their culture until the last speakers of their language fell silent, and their final ships rotted on forgotten beaches. Within a few centuries, they were gone, and in their place, European historians constructed the myth of the Vikings. It's a masterful piece of historical revisionism, replacing an uncomfortable truth about a lost non-European civilization with a palatable story about familiar Scandinavian raiders. We can't prove the Murmans existed using conventional historical methods, because those methods are designed to validate the official narrative. But we can look at what doesn't fit, at the anomalies that historians dismiss or ignore, the maps that show lands that shouldn't be there, the navigation systems that point to the wrong locations, the artifacts that are too advanced for their supposed makers, the skulls that are too different from standard human morphology, the names on medieval charts that predate their official coinage by centuries. Each piece of evidence alone can be explained away, but together they form a pattern that points to a truth more complex and disturbing than the Viking myth allows. Our history is not what we've been taught. The comfortable narrative of gradual progress from primitive past to modern present is a lie. Advanced civilizations have risen and fallen, their existence scrubbed from the record by those who came after. The Murmans are just one example, but they're an important one because their disappearance is so recent. The maps that document their lands were still being copied in the 17th century. The linguistic evidence of their names survives on modern charts. The physical evidence of their racial characteristics lies in museum storage, labeled as anomalous but never properly explained. We're not talking about ancient history from thousands of years ago. We're talking about a civilization that existed when Europe was building cathedrals and exploring the New World. A civilization that was contemporary with the societies we study in detail, yet somehow left no recognized historical record. How is that possible unless there was a deliberate effort to erase them from history? The answer lies in the same forces that created the Viking myth. Those who control the present control the past. Those who control the past control the future. Admitting the Murmans were real means admitting that our historical timeline is fundamentally broken, that advanced peoples existed outside the accepted narrative, that the story of human civilization is far stranger and more discontinuous than we've been told. It means accepting that maps drawn centuries ago might be more accurate than modern ones, that primitive peoples might have possessed knowledge we've lost, that the history we memorized in school is more fiction than fact. The establishment can't allow that, so they created Vikings, gave us horned helmets and dragon ships and the entire romantic package. They made sure the myth was so entertaining, so deeply embedded in popular culture, that questioning it seems ridiculous. But now you know. Now you've seen the evidence. The next time you hear about Vikings, remember the elongated skulls. Remember the prime meridian through Iceland. Remember the name on the map that existed before it was supposed to. Remember the Murmans, the civilization that history tried to forget. They were real. They controlled the northern seas. They built ships that we still can't replicate. They mapped the world while Europe was struggling through its dark ages. And then they vanished, drowned by rising oceans and erased by historians who found their existence too inconvenient to acknowledge. The biggest lie in history isn't that Vikings never existed. It's that they did exist, just not as we've been told. The real Vikings, the real masters of the northern seas, were the Murmans. Everyone else was just picking up the pieces of what they left behind.